All right. Well, thanks everybody who showed up and are joining us. For those of you who are logging in, I think we know everybody, but just to recap, we'll introduce ourselves to start with, and then we'll move into our presentation. I'm Greg Ketcham. I'm the Assistant Dean for the Division of Extended Learning, marking my 20th year here at SUNY Oswego this month. How exciting is that? At least that's what LinkedIn tells me, so we'll believe it to be true. I started here as the sole campus instructional designer. Over time, as online learning has grown, we've obviously increased our support staff and our commitment to online learning, which is really the reason we're here today to give you this particular session. And Theresa, what else would you like to say besides introducing yourself?
Oh, I'm Theresa Gilliard-Cook. I'm the Associate Director of Instructional Design. And no, I haven't been here as long as Greg has. I think I've been here 12 and a half years. And when I started, it was Greg and Doug and me. And now it's me, Doug, and Carrie. So it has changed and we've grown, and our role has changed somewhat too. So it's been some changes and some differences in how we practice.
So, Theresa, you want to bring up the slide deck?
Sure.
Really, then, that brings us to what we're here to talk about today, and certainly to listen to you and to hear your thoughts, comments, questions, suggestions as well, um, around the idea of, as the title of the session said, the actual evaluation of online learning. And to clarify what that really means in the context of this session is the evaluation of teaching of online learning as performed as part of the peer review process, typically for tenure and promotion decisions. So I want to just frame that for everybody to know what your expectations are in terms of what we're talking about today. Okay. Next slide, Theresa. So the idea here today is really to talk about some of the underlying drivers that lead us to thinking about how we evaluate online learning, what should be present in an online course, how do you recognize those particular elements, and pardon me, how unfortunately that all ties into federal regulation and compliance, because that is really part of what is the underpinnings of what we're talking about today. This particular act in the Code of Federal Regulations that's referred to as RSI for short, or Regular and Substantive Interaction. So we're going to spend some time talking about that today, what that means, what that looks like, how you can create regular and substantive interaction opportunities in your online courses, and why, if you're an evaluator looking at a peer's online course, these are important things that you should be looking for. Okay, so next slide. So one of the interesting things about the regulations around RSI is it says the college has a responsibility to ensure that instructors are in fact creating opportunities for regular and substantive interaction in their online courses. So that implies the college has some means of saying, this is what an ideal or optimal online course looks like. And through dialogue with Dean's Council, we developed a framework, really a set of expectations that you'll find linked at the very end of this presentation. So I'm not going to go into it a lot, but it really begins with conceptualizing the course, preparing the course, and actually teaching the course, the kinds of things that we here at SUNY Oswego expect to be happening when you're teaching online. The important thing to know about this guidance is it comes from evidence-based research. There are several quality scorecards, as we call them, quality frameworks used to assess online learning courses. Two of the most well-known ones are the Quality Matters Standard and the Oscar rubric. Quality Matters was developed probably about 20 years ago, honestly, probably about when I started here at SUNY Oswego. Just for context, it came out of a Department of Education FIPSI grant, and that FIPSI grant was awarded to the University of Maryland, who did, a meta-analysis of existing research on the practices of effective teaching and online learning. And from that developed the Quality Matters rubric, which has been and continues to be used to assess the relative quality of an online course, is its alignment to these established standards. I call it the 64 points of light because I think there's probably 63 or 64 standards total in the rubric that are used. Over time, once that FIPSI funding went away, Quality Matters evolved into what is essentially a pay-for-use service. It's its own nonprofit organization at this point, and it's fee-based in order to use the Quality Matters rubric. So partly in reaction to that, a few years ago, SUNY undertook creating a new quality framework, which is OSCAR, the online scorecard for course quality review. And the notion there, honestly, that was freely licensed under Creative Commons licensing. Many people within SUNY, many practitioners of instructional design participated in creating that OSCAR rubric, including our team, honestly. So just for a reference, that's what those are. And both of those instruments really support the idea of assessing whether or not regular and substantive interaction is present in the design of an online course. And I just want to stress that for a moment, that these quality rubrics are used to assess the creation of an online course. Now, when we're assessing a faculty member who teaches online, there are really two things to think about here. One is the actual structure of that course, okay? And then the other part of that is the actual facilitation of that course. And that's where that idea of peer evaluation comes back in, observation. It may not necessarily be the same as observing someone in the classroom per se, but being able to look at the evidence of how someone conducts their online course. Okay. So we're going to now move into a deeper dive on that. Next slide. Okay. So like I say, online learning is kind of a black box. I mean, unless you gain access to someone else's course, what you might know about how somebody else teaches is largely anecdotal. And over time, we have certainly had faculty who have a majority and sometimes 100% load is online teaching. So the process of peer evaluation, therefore, had to change and had to look different. That's why most recently, through UUP's labor management meetings with local chapter leadership and administration, we asked for a revision in the criteria for personnel decisions, specifically Section C, where it speaks about peer evaluation, to really recognize that how you evaluate online teaching out of necessity has to look different from what happens when you can schedule a classroom observation. Okay. So we've hit most of these points already, I think. But the key, honestly, is for a department, for a personnel review committee to think about the things we're about to share and think about how they could be created into a checklist or use one of these two quality frameworks, OSCAR or Quality Matters, to help guide the review process of a course when you're engaging in peer review. Okay. So Theresa, you want to run with this now?
Okay. So in creating this presentation, one of the things we did was we looked at the sections of the OSCAR rubric. So the next 5 slides are just going to broadly talk about all of the components that are in each section. of the OSCA rubric, and we've kind of tried to compile them into four major components to make it a little bit easier for faculty when they're doing peer review. One of the most important things in a course is the syllabus. So it's really important that we think about what are those components that should be in there. And one of the things that the instructional designers have created is an accessible syllabus that outlines all of the components that should be in a syllabus for particularly for an online course. But it's also important that, all of the objectives are outlined in there, the expectations, what faculty expect from their students, what students should expect from their instructor, the course schedule, all of those different components that are in there. The instructor information should be in there, as well as how students can contact you. How do you want to communicate with your students? How should your students communicate with you? What your availability is, and it should all be very clearly provided. There's usually a variety of course policies and campus policies that need to be in the syllabus. Some of them, again, we have boilerplate language to use, but for specific ones for each course, for each instructor, do you have policy in there regarding your grading? How do you want to handle late submissions? How do you discuss intellectual integrity? And then the big thing, which is we've been doing a lot of discussion about on this campus, has been including some type of verbiage pertaining to how you as an instructor will use or not use artificial intelligence tools in your course. And then, of course, then there's links out or information pertaining to other support resources, such as the technical support, how students can get assistance with Brightspace, or their email, the library resources, our Office of Learning Services. All of those pieces should be in a syllabus somewhere. And this is true, whether it's an asynchronous course, synchronous online, hybrid, or high flex. The next section in the OSCA rubric is the online course design and layout. So again, it's thinking of it from this perspective. Is it well organized? Is it logical? Is everything easy to navigate? And based on some sessions I was in earlier this week where there were some students who talked about some of these pieces, that is a really important thing for them, regardless of modality. But being able to, when they go from course to course, and us, we go, that it's pretty much laid out very much the same. And I think that's really important, because that's also what our literature is telling us too. We need to be very consistent in our visual elements. And again, a lot of this also goes back to accessibility. So consistency and accessibility could be really one point, but there are specific components that are different. So what are your visual elements? Thinking about fonts, colors, and headings. But also thinking about things too of layout. Is there enough white space so that, for example, when students are reading something that might be text dense, that they have time for the eye to rest so that they can think about, okay, what did I just read? Accessibility, again, that's another big thing. And there's another big push for that too, is pertaining to Title II. And is the course designed in a way that it's easy for students to access the materials and navigate, even if they have different kinds of differences, like color blindness, or they are totally vision impaired or hearing impaired. And then the other piece is ease of use. Is it easy to follow and find the course materials? Are the instructions easy for students to understand? Is the navigation easy for students to work through? And as our students want, is for everything to be easy for them to find when they go from course to course. The third part of the OSCA rubric talks about content and activities. We want to make sure the activities are aligned with, the course objectives and outcomes. And everything in the course also should be relevant. And Doug and Carrie and Greg know that's one of my favorite words. because again, if students can't find a way for it to be relevant, they probably will just skip over it. But it's also important too that you find ways to have the content up to date and then it's engaging. So it's a way to use different voices. One of the things we've said to faculty in the past, for example, if there are some good TED Talks out there by leading experts in your field, consider adding that into your course, because even though they're saying the same thing you did, it's just another voice. And that also speaks to the diverse resources as well, thinking about different ways so that your students have different ways to interact with the content. And are there opportunities for your students to actively engage? So again, that's many times through discussions and other assignments, but also creating collaborative activities. And again, we want to be careful in fully online courses with collaborative activities because our students have lives outside of school that impact other aspects and sometimes can be a real challenge when they are, say, working full-time and going to school full-time. Interaction. And what I did pull in here was the community of inquiry, where we talk about interaction with three different ways. And that's the student to instructor interaction, student to student interaction, and student to content interaction. But again, these are all outlined within the OSCAR rubric. So it's really thinking about, are there opportunities for regular and substantive interaction between the instructor and students? And again, here we go, talking about RSI. But that's really important. Where are those opportunities that the students can have those interactions with faculty? And of course, that can be in a variety of ways, whether it's one-on-one through course mail or individual meetings, or it can also be through discussion forums. Student to student interaction, how can you create opportunities in your course for students to interact together, whether it's obviously part of a discussion forum, or maybe they, for one assignment, you create small teams of, say, two people where they kind of team up and they maybe teach a small section, or they respond to a discussion post. They work together and create one discussion post, for example. Again, it needs to align with what you're trying to accomplish in your course. And then the last thing is what are the opportunities for students to interact with your content? How should they interact with all of the materials you provide, whether it's reading materials, worksheets, and other pieces that you might provide your students? Feedback is a huge piece. And again, we've heard from students multiple times that they need this feedback. And sometimes they're not receiving feedback in a timely manner, especially when assignment A or assignment B depends on assignment A being completed and they receiving feedback. But it's also, the feedback to students should be constructive. It should really help contribute to their ability to work through the course materials and start to grasp the content. And then what channels can students interact with their instructor, with their peers? And obviously some of those can be, forums, emails, discussions, video conferencing. There's some different things and different ways to do that. And then the whole component of this is the regular and substantive interaction, which we will talk a little bit more in detail in shortly. Next section is the assessment and feedback. And it's, a lot of times when faculty are creating courses, they are thinking about some different ways that students can interact and demonstrate that they are grasping the overarching course outcomes. And I think when you think about it from different ways, whether they're quizzes, essays, projects, journals, whatever, as long as it's something that you can really see that they're demonstrating that they're working through the materials, that also allows them to do things through different means. It's important that your instructions for whatever assessments you have in there are clear and communicated, that your rubrics are clear. And again, a rubric can certainly be a table, but it can also just be a bulleted list of the items that should be included in an assignment. Again, making sure that whatever feedback students receive is received in a timely manner, especially if one assignment builds on another, so that they are able to implement those suggestions and continue to grow. And then again, it's making sure that whatever feedback you give them is very specific, it's constructive, and it provides ability for them to improve. So, Greg, you want to go with this? It's the start of it anyway.
Sure. So, again, circling back, we've really talked so far about this idea of what I consider the carrot, if you will, which is trying to adhere to the idea of what a quality framework looks like, because the research shows us it produces positive learning outcomes. Now, the other side of this, of course, is really the stick, and the stick comes from federal regulations. So, in support of Title IV funding in the Higher Education Act, where part of it defines what, in fact, distance education means, there is a subset in those regulations that provides this definition of what regular and substantive interaction is. Now, it's important for, honestly, a number of reasons, one of which is the fact that it's tied to this idea of the elements that really should be happening in an online course, the things that we should be doing as we're teaching. But the other part that comes into this that's interesting goes back to the idea of, again, Title IV, federal funding, student loans. When we, as an institution, are reporting back out in terms of how we've dispersed funding to students, one of the things you all probably have experienced at some point is an inquiry from student accounts that asks you, what is the last date of attendance for this particular student? This is where this particular piece of regulation comes in, because it defines the kinds of things I should be looking at, Theresa should be looking at, or you as the instructor should be looking at if you're asked directly, when did the student stop participating in your course? It really is the idea that the student has engaged in meaningful graded activity in the course. So it doesn't mean, for instance, that they logged in X number of times. That doesn't count. That's not counted at all, okay? What's counted are these ideas that you'll see in terms of instructor behaviors, instructor facilitated actions. And basically, the regulation also says, out of these 5 criteria, you really only need to have 2 present. Now, I think we would suggest that having more than 2 is a really good idea, but simply having 2 out of the 5 criteria present means you're adhering to the guidance for RSI.
So this table just demonstrates before the federal regulation came into effect what the differences were. Interaction was only initiated by the instructor, but now with RSI in place, now they're saying it's mostly initiated by the faculty member, but there is some leeway. There's another component in this information that talks about the instructor, and that it used to be that they meet accreditation standards, and it's still very much similar, but it's also based on other qualifications and if there is an accrediting agency for each school. So I always think about our friends in the School of Business because of their accrediting body. And then they get into more of the meat of it with the substantive interaction and regularly required interaction. So this is what Greg was talking about too, when they're talking about the 5 pieces of the interaction component, that at least 2 of them needs to be in place in an online course. So providing direct instruction, which, I mean, again, in some cases that could be a video. Assessing or providing feedback on a student's coursework. We've talked about that multiple times, and that's also a hallmark of a well-done course. Providing information, responding to questions about the content of a course, facilitating group discussion, or other activities that would be approved by, say, your department or the institution, or as well as an accrediting agency. So at least two of those five are what are required for regular and substantive interaction. And then for the regular component, they show two different ideas on how that regular interaction should happen between an instructor and student. And again, some of that can be, where the interactions are predictable and scheduled. So again, thinking about discussion forums, that's one. Thinking about office hours, that would be another one. So that students know when they will be interacting, whether it's with their instructor, with their peers, or some combination thereof. And then it's also for faculty to monitor the students' academic engagement. And it talks about here that an instructor is responsible for promptly and proactively engaging in substantive interaction with the student when needed. So basically just reaching out to a student when you're seeing they're struggling, or maybe they haven't been present for a week or two, and just reaching out to them and saying, hey, what's going on? But at least it's demonstrating what the guidelines are telling us. So to go back to what, the characteristics of regular and substantive interaction are, it's, again, they talk about in that chart, it was initiated by the instructor. So for example, you as the instructor provide feedback in any medium. So they're talking about you can do it written, you can do it as a video, or some other way for an individual's assignment. As long as they're getting some feedback that is constructive and helpful to them to move on, or to help them grasp the course content, and that is what they're looking for. What RSI is not is you as the instructor just adding grades to the grade book. Frequent and consistent interaction. So basically, you as an instructor are you facilitate, say, the discussion board, or you're sending the course announcements to your students to let them know that they don't forget about a due date, or more or less even just providing them opportunities to, when you're seeing something maybe in the news pertaining to something new or applicable to the course materials. Sending a welcome message during the first week of class or a mid-semester is not considered regular and substantive interaction. And actually, I just talked about this last one. You post a real-life example from a current event in the discussion forum to illustrate a concept recently covered in a course. Again, that can be done, of course, in a discussion forum, but it can also be just done as an announcement where you talk about that. The other way you can use announcements to help with some of this too is as your segue. When they go from module 1 to module 2, creating that segue, and also maybe including some different things that, this student said this, but this student said that, and, finding ways to integrate that into your segue. So RSI is not you just posting an announcement about an upcoming assignment deadline, to be, as we think about the characteristic of focused on the course subject. So on this page, what we have are a couple of links to our regular and substantive interaction resources that are actually off the instructional designers page, innovation and ideas. So we created these two documents, which is, the first is an overview that talks about those three major characteristics of regular and substantive interaction. And then the second document is where it provides some ideas and suggestions to incorporate regular and substantive interaction into your asynchronous online course. The last item on here is the online learning compliance and basic expectations at SUNY Oswego, which Greg was talking about earlier, that was pulled together with input from deans. And so this last piece here, I just included some, if anybody has questions about, implementing RSI in their courses, or do they have enough of the components of regular and substantive interaction to qualify as that their course has all the pieces? Or if you just want to brainstorm other ideas, or you're developing an asynchronous course, you want to take an opportunity to have a full course review with us, or are curious about the other services we provide, you can contact the instructional designers through help@oswego.edu or at our website, Innovations and Ideas. So now, if anybody has questions, we'd be happy to discuss with you.
I'll chime in. I have bad Wi-Fi, so I'm probably going to freeze. So I might give up and go to the chat. So
okay,
sorry in advance when that happens. But I would just note, I mean, you noted at the beginning, the rubrics available are great when you're designing the course from scratch. But when a senior faculty member wants to, review a junior faculty member's online course, a peer review, kind of the equivalent of the classroom visit, because you're not digging into design. I've created my own casual one, but I think we would benefit of a campus to try to create a repository and share what people are doing to review their colleagues. These online course shells from junior faculty.
I think that's a really good idea, Liz. I mean, part of the challenge is to not reinvent the wheel every time in every department. And so what I have done when we've had chairs or personnel communities come to us and say, hey, does this exist? We tend to point to the departments who've been on the leading edge. I mean, obviously economics has done it. Computer science has done it. It's escaping me the very last department that I just had that conversation with, and they were engaging with it too. A lot of what we did actually in priming the pump, because computer science was really the first department to come to us with this need, was to curate a bunch of resources that are out there from other colleges and universities who are further along on the curve than us. Penn State comes to mind, for instance, as one of the resources that we pulled together, shared it with Computer Sciences Personnel Review Committee, and they use that as inputs into creating their process. So I think it's really important to have a process, whether it, is tailored particularly to your disciplinarity. Does it share common elements across the board? There are characteristics we just talked about that are honestly observable characteristics in the facilitation of the course. So, you as an observer, once we've gone through the process and started a formal observation of an online course, there are things that you can glean from the Oscar rubric that suggest there's things I should be looking for that we just talked about. How are those course announcements being used? What is the instructor's participation in discussion forums? What kind of feedback is the instructor giving on the assignments when they're grading? All of those things are available to our observers who we've formally granted access to that course. So those can be the basis of judgments. And I guess it's worth noting too, although Oscar has a slightly different philosophy, Quality Matters was designed really intentionally with the idea of peer review by committee. So if you've never seen it, it exists in the cloud, such that you connect it to a particular course, you assign your evaluators, everybody's using the rubric, everybody puts their own score in based on those criteria. And then at the end of the day, there has to be a conversation to mediate any scoring differences between the evaluators. Well, I think this looked great. Well, I didn't see any evidence of that. Okay, well, let's go back and walk it and understand, so we come up with a mean, if you will, on those elements that we're scoring. And the magic number, a B is good enough. When it comes to the Quality Matters scorecard, it intentionally scores out of 100, and an 87 is a passing grade, right? That means it's met out of the 17 major areas, there's sufficient evidence on the key points to call it a quality course. Now, again, I'm talking about design, okay? To be clear, I'm talking about design. But the design should also incorporate those elements for instructor presence. That's really what you're looking for when you're looking at the evidence of how the course was facilitated. Was the instructor present? Did the instructor have a role in guiding the course? Or is it effectively a robo course that, you do the work, it generates a score, you move on to the next module? So those kinds of things are what we would suggest to departments when they're creating an evaluation framework. And you can challenge me on any of that if you want or ask questions, but that's the way I think about it, and that's what we've tried to share out to other departments who've been thinking about this.
One of the other things we did too, and some of this was based on some feedback from some of our faculty who have been using the Oscar rubric in some way, shape, and form, was some faculty found it very confusing using the Oscar rubric because of how it was laid out, and it didn't provide an evaluative score. So what we did was we did create an Oswego version of the Oscar rubric, where we looked at all of these different pieces and we just used a numeric scale of 0, 1, and 2. We've done some testing with it with some course reviews we've done. We've not received really any feedback, but we're also trying to struggle with the scoring because it won't come out to 100%. I think the way it's set up is that it comes up to, I think the highest score is a 94, but I've created some different ideas on how we can look at the scoring. And again, I think we can tweak it if we want to think about it more in line with, for faculty to start using as some kind of a guide to help them develop something that's appropriate for their areas. And we can certainly help with that. Again, looking at the 4 items for each section of the Oscar rubric, we could certainly build something from there as just a start point, and then departments can tweak it as they will. Ben, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I just have a question, some clarifications or your views on this. Yesterday, I attended one of the sessions where John shared about intelligent agents. In your view, is the use of intelligent agents encouraged, or would it constitute a proper use of RSI characteristics?
I would say yes and no. I mean, yes, I'm in favor of intelligent agents as well because of the basic scaffolding that it can provide to a student. And there's a lot of targeted, individualized feedback that we've talked about over the years, from Angel to Blackboard and now to the capabilities in Brightspace. And John would know better than I have because I have not really touched Brightspace from that standpoint. But the ability to provide specific tailored feedback to students using agents is fantastic. It does scale particularly well when we talk about online. Does it constitute RSI? Well, that's an interesting question because you've sort of intentionally front-loaded the course with these elements. So from a design perspective, I would be inclined to say yes. But from a facilitation perspective, I'd be inclined to say no, because we've offloaded much of that feedback to the system, potentially, okay? But that feedback may be essentially low-level feedback in terms of, either an answer prompt or comments on a final score or achieving a minimum grade that unlocks the next unit, kind of typical things we might do with the intelligent agents. So again, from a design perspective, entirely valid, entirely useful, right? But when we take another concept, which is the concept of humanizing online instruction, okay? One of the interesting things here, and I'm going to put on my pointy hat for a minute, so if I go too far, just stop me. But in the community of inquiry framework, okay, we have the idea of instructor presence. Now, if you do a guided read on what the authors meant when they talked about instructor presence, it is really about the sort of functional guiding elements of instruction. It is really literally the things Theresa said RSI is not. Okay. If you go back and read Garrison, Anderson, and Archer, they're like, sets clear expectations, provides a timeline, all of the very structural elements that we engage in teaching. But what they didn't speak to, and which came much later, is the idea of instructor social presence. And instructor social presence is the student's perception that there is, in fact, a real live human being somewhere in the machine who's teaching this course. Okay. So if you think about these things as being complementary, that there are intelligent agents that can do a lot of baseline things to support learning for us. But the humanizing component, really creating that connection between the learner and the instructor, comes from the kind of individualized feedback, the individualized interactions that we create. Theresa said this earlier, and I can say this personally as a learner, that one of the most powerful things I ever experienced in my graduate program online was what I'll call the romper room effect. Now, if you don't know, like some people on this are not old enough to have experienced romper room in their childhood, like others of us, but it was a show, kind of a pre-K television show, right, in instructional television. And at the end, the host of the show, who was inevitably female, would hold up this kind of imaginary mirror type thing or looking glass thing. And she would say, as she looked into the camera, I see Ben, and I see Carrie, and I see Rebecca. And, as a child, if your name happened to come up in rotation, you're like, oh my God, she can see me through this magic box. This is incredible, right? And you felt seen. And so the parallel to that in online learning, as Theresa highlighted, is taking the end of a student discussion activity and perhaps summarizing, but perhaps highlighting specific contributions students made in, let's say, the end of module course announcement, which is what one of my instructors did in my graduate program. And it again, literally makes you feel seen. It feels that you are part of a learning community, that your contributions were valued by the instructor, and it calls attention to your peer learners. Maybe I should go back and read what it was that Ben said if the instructor thought it was great, right, and useful. So my long way around on this, Ben, is saying that there are baseline things that the learning management system can do that absolutely scaffold learning, but there's still a need for the human element to personalize, to guide each individual, and that ties in very closely to this idea of what RSI should be. Okay, so there's my really long monologue, but that's the way I think about it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So others who are with us, Rebecca or John, any thoughts or observations from your end?
I do, Greg. Good to see you again today.
Yeah, good to see you.
So what are best practices for getting regular and substantive student interaction so that we get like the social that we need to react and respond to them appropriately? That is the thing I struggle with the most in my online teaching, is that it is so hard to get a sense of who the students are. And it's so hard to get a sense of who the students are to together, right? And I
Mhm.
really thrive and I love it. In a classroom, you've been in there a couple, 2, 3 weeks, there's a little cohort going, you've got a couple of running jokes happening, right? Like you can, like that kind of facilitation I love. And it's so hard, I feel, to get it going in an online course when the students are really, I mean, some of them are really guarded. Some of them, like, they'll only give you a sentence, like they'll give you the minimum possible response to any prompt at all. And you're just like, oh my God, you gotta just give me something to work with here, please. So can I make them do like a video introduction like I do? I mean, not make them, you don't make anything.
Right. I mean, you can certainly
What's best
encourage that.
practices here? That doesn't, like during the pandemic, we were all worried about making people turn on their cameras because that can exacerbate inequalities and do a lot of discomforting things. And, I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. Absolutely not. But oh dear God, like I've got to meet these people and know who I'm working with.
Yeah. I mean,
I
I don't want to be tempted to answer that because by no means am I an expert. I want the instructional designers to maybe make some suggestions in here. And honestly, too, for folks who've been doing this for as long as they have, for John, for Liz, for Ben, I want to open the floor to what they have to say in terms of their techniques as well, because I will not claim to have one answer to your question, which is the driving question always. So
Well,
who wants to tackle that first?
Well, I also think we need to remember too that our students are different now, especially our young ones, as I tend to call them. But their experiences have really, in some ways, skewed their view of how they learn, especially after COVID. So I just want to put that in there too. But to answer your question, Rebecca, Doug and Carrie, jump in whenever. Um, the idea of you can certainly as if you're thinking, like, for example, in your online course, the icebreaker activity. Okay, we always ask, give us a little bit about you or something like that. You can say to them they can do it however. They could do it as an infograph. They can do it as a video. They can use an avatar in the video if they don't want to show their face, because there's a lot of students that don't want to do that. They can use an image that maybe represents something that's really important to them, whether it's their dog or cat, but it's encouraging them to express themselves um, in a way that they would find comfortable. But it's still a struggle to get them to say a whole heck of a lot.
So yeah, for the inequality point of view, it's really about giving them as many options as possible. And so there's full video, but there's a range of audio only options that Theresa referenced. But you do kind of have to give that backup of, yes, if you have to, you can type it out, but be nice about it. Don't see it as sarcastically as I did. But I think also it's a question of trying to get the students to talk about their interest and why they're taking a course, or you can always reference it out to current events. What's something in anthropology that has drawn your attention recently, and anything that'll sort of pull on a string to get them talking, because it really is that initial conversation that's the most painful, and once they get over that, usually it's a little bit easier. The only warning that I'll throw out with the recording is that you do have to make sure that they're using some system that at least provides auto subtitling. So Panopto and YouTube both do that, but they can't just record a video on their phone and throw it up. At least not directly and not yet.
If
We'll
they
see, maybe
record, so sorry, Doug. If they record within Brightspace, is there auto captioning?
No. Unless
Can it be an option in Brightspace ever at all? That would be really nice.
I can't say. I don't recall seeing it on the roadmap. But with AI going out and about, that's something that AI is being trained on, is doing better subtitles. So it's possible we'll see something. But right now, the two main systems are you can set up a Panopto Dropbox through Dan Laird, or you can just tell them throw it on YouTube and share the link with me. And at that point, they can make it a private email. Everybody has access to YouTube because it's part of our Gmail package. So that's kind of my thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to tell you that I actually, Jessica Harris had a session the other day that was on a wellness-centered approach. But I do have to say some of the strategies that she talked about could be applied here really well. There are some fun ones that I was looking. So I actually asked her for her presentation so that I could review that, because it would be taking some of the information she had and applying it in a different manner, but I still found it beneficial to look at. Going back to the getting to know you activities, there are some different ways. Like, you don't have to ask just the standard questions. You could throw in some different ones that may tell you something about their personality, whether it's the favorite movies or something like that. Like, there's a way to make that more of a fun way to bring some conversations between you and the students
We always start
in
with
an
what
informal way.
superpower. We always start with what superpower would you want?
Oh, that's a good one. I
I
like
like
that.
that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You'd be amazed at how many people say they want to be invisible and spy on others. Just saying.
Oh, I was trying to think what mine would be, but yeah. So, I think there's been some faculty that have had a lot of fun with that, been in some different courses and seen some different ways that they build some connections. Something that I saw a long time ago that I always think about when we talk about being included in a classroom. There was a faculty, it was an art history course. This isn't at Oswego, but it was an art history course, and he was on vacation somewhere, another country somewhere, and he actually was taking video of what he was seeing, and he sent it to his students. And that just said that even on vacation, I'm still thinking of you. And I think that's a very valuable, that makes feel part of a community, that somebody would care outside of the office hours. So it just was a little thing that I always thought that was fun that he did, that probably I would think would make an impact with students and your connection with them.
So now I also want to then quiz our faculty friends who are here with us too, in terms of what they do. I mean, Liz, John, Ben, because you obviously deal with these same issues too, of trying to get to know students as individuals. What do you do that you find that works?
One thing that I've been doing for about 8 or 9 years was using this metacognitive cafe. Actually, Jessica was using it and presented on it, but it's just a low stakes discussion forum where students are reflecting on their learning journey, and they're talking about the challenges they face and how they've resolved them, what learning strategies have worked effectively for them. And they start sharing a lot about their lives, about their family, about their work conditions, about their living conditions. And all that tends to build a really good sense of community, because just as a natural part of those discussions, students reveal things that they feel comfortable revealing. And that shows up in the content discussion forums and some of the other things as well, which has worked remarkably well in building that sort of community.
Excellent.
I've also had students do podcast projects where they talk often about connections to things in their lives related to what they're learning. And that also provides a nice sense of connection.
My discussions too, and part of this was, I'm a lot more focused to try and get around an AI response in the discussion forum, that they really have to come up with, personalize it. So we learn about banking regulations or banking, functions and things like that. So you can have a discussion board where they talk about, an example in their life to facilitate transactions in their life and where they fall short. And so they have to make, and like John mentioned, a lot of the context of that, things come up, they reveal something about who they are. In money and banking, I have a bunch of people that work at banks, bank tellers and things like that, on their way to get a degree to try and move up. And so, they'll talk about that. I know a lot about the nightmare processing the PPP applications during COVID based on bank employees that were taking my class. period of time, and things like that. So that has a double, like I said, it has a double bonus where people can reveal in ways that are comfortable to them, right? They got a wide berth in how and what they reveal. And I think it makes it harder to generate an AI response and not consider the question.
So in my experience, I acknowledge all that I've, the previous speakers have said. But what I tend to realize is that every class, every semester seems to be unique. What works for a particular semester, for a particular group, may not work for the next group. So whatever you want to really see in that class in terms of the social climate of the class, you will dictate it. If you want more friendliness, let the tone of your mails and correspondences be friendly. So that way it helps them to know, oh, this guy is friendly. They will try to be more friendly in their conversations. Then in the discussions, if you want more personal examples, also provide personal examples from your own perspective. That's what I'm saying.
Ben, thank you. I think that's a really good point in terms of what we model does in fact set the tone for students. The degree of formality versus informality, the amount of personal information we share. And that's one of the things we've talked to all of you about when we've asked you if you wanted to create a video presence in your online course. Again, the idea is to humanize, to let people know who you, Ben Ugwo, who you are, right? Where did you come from? How did you get here and why? And what is it that gets you out of bed every morning that brings you here to teach and pursue your passion? I mean, those are the kinds of things then that Rebecca's really kind of asking us to flip the table and get our students to share that with us. And it's interesting because, you're in a social media age, you're in a performative age, supposedly, with TikTok, yet at the same time, my Atlantic Monthly landed in my mailbox yesterday, and I haven't cracked it open yet, but the title on the cover of this month is Living in the Antisocial Age. So it's interesting, and it kind of again goes to previous metaphors, the bowling alone metaphor, that social media is in some ways fostering weak ties, but not giving us the same kind of strong connections that we build through direct interpersonal relations. And so I just wonder if that bears out somewhat too within online instruction, which, in and of itself is inherently disintermediated to begin with, that we aren't hanging out after class, we aren't going to grab a cup of coffee together to get to know each other. So it does increase those barriers to creating those kinds of relationships. And I do think the kind of informal things we've already talked about and suggested, like, your pet. People love to talk about pets if they're a pet owner. Just as an icebreaker is a weird, effective thing to begin to draw people in. So thank you everybody for sharing those ideas. Those are great ideas. And I love hearing the range of strategies that everybody uses. For those who are just kind of joining us at this point, not to put anybody on the spot, but we were just talking about ways in which we might be able to engage our students more directly to share more personal elements of themselves in an online course. So, Tina, Dan, if you have any thoughts around that and things that you've done that you want to share, please feel free.
I was really sad for a minute, Greg, because I'm getting a puppy in about 2 months. And I'm like, man, if I just had that puppy right now, I could pop on video and have it like right up in the screen when he's talking about pets. So a lot of what we do in experiential learning with students when we're teaching GST courses, we find a lot of value in getting students, just like every faculty, I think, thinking outside the box, right? And what they're used to seeing and hearing every day. One of the things that I've always enjoyed doing with students, I actually bring a set of values cards to the start of my GST courses that are in person. And a lot of times after one session, we actually have them, I focus a lot of my first initial sessions in them meeting each other. Whether it's GST 104 and their first year students, and the point is to help them build community in that first year seminar, or they're not, and I'm teaching a GST 101 that's a mix of freshman through senior. We getting them to know each other, and then at the end of the first session, I actually have them assign each other values cards, and they get to keep those cards throughout the class, and we refer back to those values cards throughout the entire semester, in both their projects and also how we use them in when I pair them up for groups, to kind of assign them in opposite values groups and team partners to learn from someone who's as most difficult or most different from them as possible when it comes to their value sets. And I find that they learn a lot from each other throughout the course in being paired with someone who is as different from them philosophically as possible in their value set. That's just something I do, but.
No, I actually like that, Tina, because again, I'm teaching the online section of 104. And we went through it the first time, and I think for the most part it was pretty successful, but I like that idea. It's just sometime with online, it can be difficult to pair students up, because their lives can be so different from each other's. And again, with the institution, accepting students that, in our online programs that are our young ones and our adult students, sometimes that can be a real challenge. But I have to think about that and see the way I can find a way to implement that in a way that doesn't cause too much.
There's definitely a way. There's a online version of those cards too, and we actually have the physical versions of values cards. I think Career Services actually owns them, but Mallory knows. She's the one that showed them to me in the first place. We use those even like at our team retreats, and it's interesting too, I think, for a lot of our students who are maybe technical sciences or technical thinkers, or because I was a biochem student, and for me, someone would ask me about my values my first year of college, and I'm like, values? What are you talking about? I'm here for science. Like, it wasn't really what I was about. And I've become a lot different since, I think students don't realize that was what I came from, was thinking career services and experiential learning offices both know I was the student that was like, no, this isn't for me. Like, I don't need this stuff, and that all changed over the years. So, anything I really started seeing the use of values more so in our community service area back when we had Alyssa Amiot as our community services coordinator, and then Catherine Farrell too, when she was used values cards and value sets a lot. And I just saw the community that was being built on things like alternative break trips, even when I participated in them as a student, and it just broke down the shyness between students, whether they were extrovert or introvert, didn't really matter. But yeah, it's always helped a lot in my classes.